Welcome to this World City panel discussion. We're going to talk about something today that's near and dear to all of our hearts, and that is the future of the office, whether home office or offices that we go to. And to answer questions about this, I'll be speaking to experts on office design and work culture on 2 continents. Joining us from Singapore is James Andrade, who's Senior Vice President and Head of Learning and Innovation at global real estate company Capitaland. And from London, joining us are Helen Arvanitakis, Director of London's new Design District, and Tom Lloyd, who's the co-founder of Pearson Lloyd, and that's a design studio also based in London. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So to provide some context, let's sort of go back to before the pandemic at the beginning of this year to look at how offices were faring and sort of some of the innovations that were in the pipeline at the time. It's interesting because here in Germany, for example, you have a strict separation between work and home cultures. So home officing was something that was pretty much unheard of in most instances. Obviously, the times have changed since then, but Tom, let me start with you. What were some of the innovative approaches that were being thought up for the vision of the office in 2021 back at the beginning of this year?
I think one of the drivers of all office culture in the last 20 years has been around technology. And technology is the thing that has both liberated and driven change for all our lives. And it's the thing that continues to kind of unlock ways in which you interact with people. And I think that with pre-pandemic, that clearly that's been driven forward by the pandemic, but pre-pandemic, that was still very much a strong and powerful part of that process. I think co-working was seen as a niche only 18 months ago, and suddenly it's becoming an enterprise, or was becoming even then an enterprise culture. So you've got some physical changes going on and some technological changes going on.
Real estate, James? I mean, what was happening in the office real estate sphere? Was it sort of skyrocketing and taking off, hitting an all-time high, or because of this co-culture that Tom was speaking about, where there are some dips there?
Yeah. So Singapore is somewhat of a gateway to Asia. So you have a number of multinational companies that have their headquarters based in Singapore. So you had a number of companies that were moving into the traditional offices that we all know and are knowledgeable about. But you're also seeing the rise of co-working spaces. So for example, Capitaland has a product called Bridge Plus, where we were bringing in startups. We're bringing in small and medium-sized enterprises, and we were curating those to make sure that we got an interesting mix of technologies as well as businesses in a very flexible workspace. So pre-COVID, you were seeing a lot of the traditional offices as well as the co-working spaces.
And so the interest was very much there for this, even though there were these innovative ways of going about officing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you did see the tech companies that were doing much more of the at-home or remote type of work, but most traditional companies were in their traditional offices or in the flexible workspaces.
So Helen, what happened when the pandemic came? I mean, was it a fundamental change in the way we have like office philosophy, if you will, or was it sort of a faster adaptation to this technology that has already been mentioned, was already around, whether it's Zoom or Skype or digital?
I think for me, the experience that I'm having is that actually it's a bit of a combination. The design district is workspace for people in the creative industries, and inevitably there are a large proportion of people in the creative industries who do things with their hands. They literally cannot do it in their spare bedroom or at the kitchen table. So we've definitely got a number of people who we're talking to who need to have that physical space, and actually their needs for that space probably haven't changed significantly over the last 6 months. However, of course, there are a number of businesses that are more desk-based. And for us now, we're trying to think about ways that we can operate our space that will make it more relevant for what I'm starting to think of as a kind of mixed approach to the traditional work environment. By which I should explain that. Sorry, by which I mean probably a little bit of working at home and a bit of office-based working.
Gentlemen, do you agree? Do you think, or how would you describe this sort of shift? Is it a shift in philosophy, or is it a shift in basically adaptation?
I think the first 6 months was all about improvisation. We were it was a makeshift world. We were simply in fight or flight mode. None of us knew what we were doing. We were all having to make judgments at speed. I think we're now beginning to see that some of the trends that are being established through the pandemic will be long-term trends or permanent trends. And we've all discussed the fact that it's effectively accelerating trends that were already in play, but at sort of warp speed. It's a sort of Star Trek kind of event. So I think we're now having to begin to look into the future and wonder, maybe a vaccine doesn't come around the corner. Maybe we've got these kind of new constraints on our working and daily life that are here for the next 3 to 5 years.
So James, is remote and online work here to stay, or do you foresee a counter trend?
Yes and no. In the short term, I think that people have learned now what they can do outside of the office. And you're seeing a number of companies, employees are feeding back, upwards of 40% of the employees are asking for either work from home or work elsewhere other than the office. And many of the multinational companies in Singapore have stated that they probably won't start back in office in any great degree until next year. So work from home is in the short term going to stay. But longer term, Soraya, I'm not convinced. I'm a neuroscientist by training, and people are wired to connect. It's built in, and we need that social component. The other thing is that people need stimuli. They need things that give a certain level of arousal to the brain, that produces the ability to learn and the ability to take in information. And so you need those changes, and offices in the future are going to be challenged to make sure that they provide that, to make it a destination where people go to, not just to do work, but for community and for creativity and innovation.
So Helen, you're obviously involved with a project that involves people coming back to the office. Do you think people are ready to return to an office setting outside of the home, or are we still looking at a year off given the fact that the pandemic is not under control?
I think, it's a really interesting question, and one that I wish I knew the answer to. I know what I hope the answer to be, but it may not be that simple. And I completely concur with what James has been saying, and that actually ultimately we are social people. And the project that I'm working on is Workspace for the Creative Industries, and I believe very firmly that the creative process doesn't work particularly well in a totally digital environment. It definitely benefits from some human interaction. And therefore, inside the creative industries, I don't see a permanent working from home future. I don't see that it would benefit the process, the outcome, the output from those individuals. But I can definitely see that there are, of course, some advantages to the situation that we've got now, particularly for, families who've got children that they are now able to spend perhaps a bit more time with, the downtime that you experience perhaps when you're commuting. There are, of course, a number of different advantages, and I would like to think that there is a future that perhaps has a little bit of a balance.
Tom, you're in the creative industries and you run a business as well. How is it for you personally? How has the pandemic changed the way you work?
Well, I think we're all sort of saying the same thing. I don't think that anyone is proposing that we all stay at home for 40 hours a week. And I don't think anyone is imagining actually that we all come back to the office 40 hours a week. I think it's clearly, there's a trigger that's happened, which is people are beginning to understand that maybe 1 or 2 days a week at home is good for people's mental health. It might be also good for the bottom line for the real estate companies because they can reduce their footprints a bit. It might be good for cities because you can reduce the load on transport systems. You know, there's actually, there are macro issues. I'm not quite answering your question. There are macro issues that
That's
are
okay. We'll get back to that.
that are
Go ahead.
influencing, you know, in a much more complex way, what that this future might look like. And I think that's probably where we'll end up. We've just started back 2 weeks ago with a 2-day-a-week in the office strategy. We're just, you know, 12 people. We're a small business, but we're trying to make sure that we interact and we get together when we need to, but then we go home when we've got heads down, we work at home. When we need to collaborate and be creative with each other, we definitely need to be together.
But do you find that the creative process is harder when you're trying to do this at home rather than when you're in an environment where you're with your workers and you're exchanging ideas in real time rather than having to do it on Skype?
Absolutely, it's hard. Yes, we've really suffered, I think, from the lack of, and it's, you know, you can't, it's the little micro conversations, the little accidental interactions that we all know is both good for your spirit, it's good for the community and the sense of team building, but it's also good for the creative process because for us, we might walk past a drawing on a wall and we make a judgment or we make an observation and that immediately gets sort of fed through into the team. You can't do that when you're having organized Zoom conversations.
James, I'll give away a little, I'm sorry, go ahead. I was going to go to you anyway, but I was going to give away a little secret and say that you're actually at home, even though it looks like you're in the office. I'm wondering how that process, you know, working at home versus how you've balanced it, how that's worked for you.
Well, I was just going to comment on Tom's statement that one of the things that I miss quite a bit, we have a very close team. And one of the things that we did quite a bit was something that we called bounce and build, where, you know, something would come up unplanned, unexpected, spontaneous, and we would just grab a conference room and just begin to build on each other's ideas. And, you know, you lose some of that spontaneity through the Zoom world and the at home. But, you know, we adapt. And, you know, we adapt from the creative process by having scheduled meetings that spend a lot more time building community, because I would say that's the other important part. Hand in hand with innovation is a sense of community that you feel with the people that you work with. And so we spend a lot of time making sure that we don't lose that community component. And it was something that if you had asked in terms of work in the office, we didn't think that much about it, but now we miss it because we are separate. And now you almost have to plan for community time to do the innovation that happened more spontaneously in the office.
Helen, certainly the governments in our various countries and even beyond have played a big role in how we're officing. If there's a lockdown, or if they're saying you must go back to work, depending, I guess, if you're in someplace in the United States where they're not doing that. How has this, I mean, what role do you see government taking in this? What should they be doing? What are they doing that's not really helpful as we try to move forward in inventing the future office?
I mean, I think for me, what's missing right now is a really big, strong dose of pragmatism. And it's certainly in the UK, I don't know how Tom feels, I'd be interested to hear it, but it feels like we've got a sort of slightly sledgehammer and a nut situation going on. And that perhaps if we could be a bit more pragmatic or a bit more nuanced about how we were responding to this situation, we may find ourselves in a much less disastrous economic, but also mental health and the various other issues that we've got looming now situation in the future. And I think for me, where I really struggle with the kind of the approach that we've had in the UK is that it doesn't deal with the specific requirements that are needed by the area, not just in terms of ensuring that you know, COVID is responded to in an appropriate way, but all of the other considerations that a community, a society needs in that location. And for me, that's a problem.
So Tom, she wanted to hear what you thought.
Yeah, I mean, I think probably similar, but I'll say it in a slightly different way. I think the way the government talks is that you have to look at the health interests of the community and the economic interests of the community. But actually, if you look at the data, the ones who manage to limit COVID are the ones who have the least economic damage. So actually, they seem to see that they're creating this polarity between we have to look after the economy and we have to look after people's health. But actually, if you just focus on the health, your economy doesn't hurt so much because you don't have such a long pandemic experience. So, I mean, this is a policy thing, but I think the narrative is all wrong. They've set up this duality when we don't know which choice to make because we both have an economic life and we have a health life, and so it's an impossible paradox. It's a paradox as a question or as a challenge for us all in the community.
So James, how does Singapore balance that? I mean, Singapore has actually been recognized as one of the places that's been quite proactive and quite successful with at least, containing the virus in the first phase or the first wave. How do you balance that? And how does the office model or the way we think of work have to be adjusted? I mean, is it just a matter of working from home and having a Zoom, or is there another way that's sort of in between being in the office and being at home on your laptop?
Yeah. So Singapore took a very proactive, aggressive, early approach to the pandemic. The focus really was on health and safety. And so there was a strong effort on getting people out of the offices, getting them out of confined spaces and working from home. The other thing is Singapore is a very technologically oriented country. It's small, and so it can do things that perhaps larger countries would struggle with. And so it was within very short time that we had apps on our mobile devices where you would trace where you were. Contact tracing was much easier to accomplish than perhaps in a much larger country. And the citizens complied and listened to the government. Now, it has had a significant impact on businesses. Being in the real estate industry, I can tell you that, malls, office buildings suffered quite a bit. They're still challenged today. But as I said, people have started moving to compensate. So we have gone from stage 3, which was very much a lockdown from a circuit breaker perspective, to something that's relaxed more. We have split teams that trade off time in the offices, and everyone is looking forward to getting to a phase 1, which is going to give greater freedom and flexibility.
So how do you develop community at work, something which you obviously specialize in this environment where you have split teams or you have everybody forced to stay home? I mean, are there steps or are there innovations that help at least provide some kind of office cohesiveness, even if you're not physically co-located?
Are you asking me, Soraya?
Yeah, I am.
Yeah.
I am.
Yeah. There's a number of things that we do. So, you do the traditional things like, you utilize your technology. We've become very friendly with Zoom and Microsoft Teams. You schedule a lot more because you can't rely on impromptu meetings. So you do all those things. And this may sound a little bit strange coming from a real estate person. I don't think it's the technology and I don't think it's the building that ultimately provides you that connection. I actually think it's the values. And if you have the right set of values, that's what really sustains you when times are tough like this. And so we have values that say that, we are going to connect. And we have values that say that we're going to make an effort to make sure that we bring people in and not leave folks out on the periphery. And that's what's helping to sustain the camaraderie and the culture, so to speak, at a time when folks are dispersed.
Helen, what do you think? Is it values or is it something else? I mean, you're working on a new design district in London, and I'm sure you've had to change what you're doing because of the pandemic.
Yeah, absolutely. We have. I think James is right. Having values, ones which you can actually live out in the way that you work, despite the fact that it's entirely digital, is definitely a big helper. I've been surprised and totally delighted by particularly the younger people that I work with, and how they're just so much more technically fluent. They are used to communicating and hanging out with people, so to speak, in this way. So for them, the transition's actually been a lot easier. If anything, I think probably I've struggled with it more than they have, wanting to make sure that everyone's doing okay, and frankly, not particularly enjoying the technology side of it. But when it comes to the district itself and getting people in there, we're looking very carefully at what community will mean, certainly initially, whilst we're expecting technology to be a big part of that, and it to be less about, or less, not entirely about, the physical space and people being physically together.
So Tom, do you see that the offices then becoming smaller because you may have tag team sort of approaches where some people come to the office and others don't, because the pandemic is obviously forcing us to be in smaller numbers. So how does that sort of affect what an office looks like, or how you design equipment or furniture for an office?
I think it's very much going to be a sort of short, medium, long term. There are answers for now, for even 3 months away, for 6 months away, because at the moment our densities have to be so much lower. You reduce the capacity by 50%, but you increase, but you all need social distancing. Actually, the building needs to be of the same size right now. So in a funny sort of way, we're having to use the space that we have, but with fewer people in the building. And I think that goes across the board. I think over time, as organizations begin to, and urban planners begin to understand the benefits of people working from home for 1, 2, 3 days a week, you'll start to see people modifying their real estate portfolio. And I'm sure James will be able to advise on that better, to sort of
I hope not, Tom.
respond. I'm not saying shrink, James, I'm not saying shrink. But we've been talking a lot about the idea of networks, and networks is both a social thing, it's a digital thing, and also it's a community thing. And I think we've got to almost see the home as satellites of all our organizations. And it's not like people are just away, they're still very much a part of the community and the physical act of working together. It's just more distributed. We'll probably end up needing the same amount of footprint, but the way in which it's developed and implemented for each organization will become very, very different. And I think
so I'm sorry, go ahead. I didn't mean to cut you off.
In our sort of design language, we used to talk about social and collaborative in the office being almost the same thing. And now we're beginning to see that split. So you have, at the moment during the pandemic, you have to have slightly less social in a physical terms and more collaborative. So you need to come together more intensely to work together, but then you go away again in order to keep safe. So the kind of balance of working styles are changing over time. How this rolls out, someone was saying to us recently that long term is 6 months. So, so you can't see beyond a 6 month. So it's very difficult to plan. So in that sense, we have to be very agile, very flexible in terms of our business strategies, in terms of our real estate strategies, and in terms of our kind of workplace implementation.
So what kind of office are customers looking for? I'll throw this out to all three of you. For example, I used to work for National Public Radio, and most people I know who worked there really hated the giant open office they had. It was like 4 stories, and each floor was almost completely open with a few offices for some managers, but the idea was collaboration in a giant open space. Is that even like realistic in the future? I mean, are we going back to compartmentalizing? And again, as you mentioned, we're doing this networking sort of differently, some of it online, some of it in person, but all very aware of the pandemic. So I don't know who wants to take a stab at that one. Okay, go ahead.
So I think that's a really interesting question, Sarah. we've started to think about it actually from an operational point of view, as much as from square meterage. So one of the things that we've been looking at is whether or not it would be possible to lease space to businesses for a number of days a week, but over a normal contract term. So if you imagine a scenario where a business wants to bring, probably only really works for smaller businesses, but they want to bring everyone together, but perhaps only for 2 or maybe 3 days a week, we can then reorganize that space so that it can be leased to a completely different business for it to be their headquarters for 2 or 3 days a week, i.e. the rest of the time. And then that business can rent their space just for the days that they use it, and have a couple of organized days away where they're dispersed and not together. And I'd like to think that would be a response to what we believe might be at least a medium-term response to COVID. But also financially for the smaller businesses, it might be a nice way to ease what is inevitably going to be a tough few years ahead, ease their way back into having a full-time space 365 days a year.
James, what's your view, and how do you make money at this at real estate if that sort of old interpretation or sort of bigger is better is going away?
We have very smart people right now that are actually turning that over, and I'm interested in Helen and Tom's perspectives, because I may have them on speed dial after we're done to get their thoughts. I mean, at the end of the day, I think there are a couple of principles that are going to be key to whatever the office of the future looks like. One is, and we talked about it, community, because we're finding that people that have been working from home, while they like the convenience and things along that line, they're actually starting to miss some of the coworkers that they had. We find ourselves constantly telling people to turn their cameras on just so we can actually see another human being as opposed to the avatar. So the community component is going to be key. The other one, and this is a little bit of what you see in the background, Capitaland has made a strategic investment to create a shared executive learning center in their project buildings. And so this is an example of one that's being put up in the Science Park area of Singapore, with the idea that workers shouldn't just be doing work. They should also be building their skills and learning. And so Catapult would be open for tenants within Capitaland buildings, but also across Singapore for mid-level managers to develop their soft skills. Now, this is something that would make the office a destination for people. So at the end of the day, we're trying to turn the office not just a place where you do work, but a place that is community and where you build skills, and it becomes a destination for you to go to, not just a place where you do your work.
So is there a scenario in which you think you can do all of this at home, or that you really require that? I mean, you mentioned the need for human contact and seeing something other than an avatar, James, but I'm wondering, Helen, do you see a scenario where you could really recreate that work environment at home and not necessitate that interaction anymore? I mean, sort of like a dystopian view of what might come because of disease.
Yeah, I mean, I think we definitely need to plan for a scenario. We need to plan for this to happen again. The population is so huge, and globally our lifestyle choices are not good ones for the environment, and this is the result. And unless we saw a massive change in human behaviours, I think we need to expect that something like this may well happen again. I still believe very firmly that face-to-face real life contact is not only a human need, but it definitely has a much more positive impact on whatever your work or your output may be. And I find it very difficult to imagine a scenario where working entirely in a digital realm it is going to be the sole replacement for our day-to-day jobs.
Tom, there are certainly some people who don't have a choice. They have to go to the office, as it were, whether it's grocery store employees, whether it's drugstore employees. I mean, I guess you could order things online, but even there, you have to have the person deliver it. What about the future office, or the pandemic office, if you will, for those people? I mean, are there adjustments that can be made so that they don't become as vulnerable as they are, since they are actually becoming people who work in these sort of environments, whether it's pharmacies or whatever, medical environment at hospitals, they tend to become more sick than the population when you look at it as a whole?
Well, I think certainly in this country, one of the aspects of this which has been most surprising is we've all realized that key workers are almost the most valuable part of our communities, and they've been the most underrepresented and the most undervalued, because they are the people delivering these frontline services where you can't, at the end of the day, you need certain face-to-face interactions with people. And whether it's nurses, policemen, firefighters, or any low-paid, allegedly unskilled or low-skilled work, still is. And so we're having to reframe what we see as the balance of kind of the hierarchy of where value lies in our communities. And there's no doubt that we have to figure that out. But I think we've got to imagine that we are going to carry on communicating and being with each other. We can't actually all lock away permanently at home. For a start, if you're in a multiple occupancy house with small children and you can't afford a laptop, then all the things we're talking about now sort of break down very, very quickly. So we've got to develop strategies that allow all the levels and layers of our community and our society to be productive within this new kind of physical constraints.
James, what about you? I mean, in Singapore, is there any sort of provision, or do you see any sort of future changes to the quote unquote office for workers who are on the front lines, who don't have the option of working from home or remotely?
You know, there have been things that have been put in place in the offices, you know, plexiglass shielding to separate folks, safe distancing, limiting the number of people that are together. So those are some of the measures that are stopgap. Longer term, we're actually still looking at what that you know, almost dystopian future that Helen was alluding to would look like. It will be a challenge, and it's one that we're going to need to look at, both in terms of retrofitting existing spaces, but how do you plan on spaces moving forward?
Let's talk about another segment of the population, and that would be, and these are people who are working at home, but it's parents. This has been a really challenging time for parents. I know in Berlin, I'm sure it's been the case in other countries as well, especially for mothers, you know, who tend to do a lot of the nurturing or caring for the children. I mean, how do you accommodate them? What can you do, or what has the experience been as far as what you have heard for women who are working from home and they have children underfoot and don't necessarily have daycare open because of the pandemic? How does this work for them? I mean, what are the pros to being at home? And is there a way to sort of design that office experience that allows them to get more out of it? And I can start with Helen. Not because you're a woman. Just
and a mother.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah, I found it, personally, I found it incredibly difficult whilst the schools were closed. I found trying to strike the balance between being a half decent parent, a teacher, and also colleague, boss, whatever else. I found it incredibly difficult. And I found my time pulled in a million different ways, sometimes within a single hour. So actually it's an incredibly complicated area, and I think I'm probably one of the lucky ones. We've got multiple computers in our house. We've got we've got lots of resources available to us that plenty of people have, simply do not have. And I mean, it's a really difficult one, Soraya. I'm not sure what the solution is. I do know that for many people, when you are able to do at least some work from home, if that means that you're able to snatch 30 minutes, an hour at the beginning or end of the day, particularly with little children who are good for nothing later on in the evening, it's a really good way to stay connected with what they are doing, what's going on in their lives, and that can only be positive, not only for the parents, but if you're feeling more relaxed about your child, then you're probably doing a better job at work as well. And from my point of view, I would always encourage any parents to try to use this time to work out how to reset the clock and make sure that there's a good, healthy balance in the future. That has to be one of the positives that's come out of this situation, is that certainly whilst the schools were closed, it was not a good situation, I would suggest, for lots of people, but perhaps with that flexible working, that we might be able to learn from it and create a more work-life balanced future.
Gentlemen, any innovation that's come out of what she's saying? I mean, which is the new reality for us?
I think I would say that, in the past, flexible working was always built into legislation, but a lot of people, a lot of owners of businesses didn't really trust it or believe in it. And I think we've all been persuaded to a certain extent that you can be productive at home. And I think there are also organizations beginning to see the commercial advantages of having of that, because we're effectively sort of outsourcing the real estate to our employees in a cynical way. But I think, so I really believe, I think that we have to get around the 9 to 5 idea of I work and then I'm not working. We're all much more fluid about that. And actually, Gen Z, I have a 17 and a 19-year-old daughters, and they, as Helen's saying, they interact in a completely different way. They're having multiple screens, 3 or 4 screens, doing all these things. It may be in theory unhealthy, but they are able to layer their experiences in a way that us sort of Gen X people mostly are sort of have no idea really. And I think we have to understand that the multi-generational side of the workplace, we all have very different learned experiences. And the new generations, millennials have been our target audience for the last 15 years. They're now getting old. They're now nearly 40. Gen Z are the new generation where we have to sort of, the people who've grown up age 10 with an iPhone in their hand in certainly affluent sort of cultures. And so they very quickly will be having a big influence on the way workplace is designed.
Well, certainly you mentioned, I think, I can't remember if you mentioned Facebook or Google, but I was thinking tech giants when you said it. And they have been outsourcing or basically relying on their employees to provide that office real estate, if you will, or to stay at home. In fact, they've talked about people working for the entire next year, or at least through the middle of next year at home. But on the other hand, these same groups are actually going out, and here in Berlin, certainly, Amazon has gotten a huge office building in Manhattan. They're gobbling up space, whether renting or buying, Amazon, Google, and so on. What's going on there? Are they seeing something that we don't? James.
Well, I can speak in Singapore. Google has a huge, enviable office. It is quite impressive. But from what I've seen of the office, it's not what you would consider a traditional office. There are very large spaces, very conducive towards group gatherings, very few what you would call traditional offices, many places where people can plug in and do work and then move on and do something else. The other thing about Singapore is the workforce within Google and some of the tech companies skews young. So working outside of the office is something that probably is not as big a challenge as someone who has childcare issues that they have to deal with. And so they flex quite a bit. The offices are built differently. The workforce is much more mobile, and it makes sense from the standpoint of, once again, this whole idea of building collaborative networks of people, as opposed to individual offices where people work in isolation.
So I'm going to have one more question for each of you to answer. What can we look forward to in offices? What is the future of offices post-pandemic? I mean, what is it what can we look forward to on that? And I'll start with Helen.
That's an interesting one. I mean, I would love to think that it's probably more of a focus on using our time inside the office to work collaboratively as a community towards a common goal or project target, whatever it may be. But I think having that space to be able to work collectively and together in a much more focused but also probably friendly way would be a great thing to come out of this.
Tom?
Well, funny enough, I was enjoying what James was saying about this idea of the office becoming a place to learn. And actually, we're currently doing a big piece of research about in the higher education sector, which has often been mirrored. It mirrors the workplace in terms of working styles, furniture applications, spatial applications, and they're beginning to influence each other in very strong ways. Flipped learning, which is this new form of learning where you're no longer taught. You actually learn collaboratively with your colleagues in a university setting. Those cultures, if we bring that back into the workplace, and as James is saying, the war of talents, which is a cliche which we've been using for decades now, companies have to attract the best people. And so lifelong learning, there's a whole series of cultures where you need to also be agile, because as the world changes, you need to reform your skill base to reflect the needs of the organization. So there's a whole lot there, which I think it's much more than just providing a service. I'm employed as X and I deliver it for 15 or 20 years and then I go, it's a much more complex and maybe much more enjoyable sort of future where you see this sort of almost like, it's like a university type setting in the workplace.
James?
Well, I agree with my my two colleagues, Soraya, and the only overlay that I would add to it is it's going to create some new challenges for architects, designers, real estate developers to create spaces that actually encourage the types of behaviors, those collaborative learning and community behaviors that I think future workers are going to be looking for.
Thank you so much, James Andrade, Helen Arvanitakis, and Tom Lloyd for spending these 45 minutes with us and telling us about the future of the office. I'm Soraya Sarhaddi Nelson.